This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences. Welcome to Sexual Encounters, the very first time, the podcast that explores real first-time experiences with honesty, curiosity, and heart. I'm your host, Mary Jane. Today, we're diving into a topic that many of us don't fully understand until it's too late: the legal side of sex. Laws about age of consent, who can do what and when, can be confusing, inconsistent, and even unfair, but the consequences can be very real. We'll unpack what the law says, what young people should know, and how legal systems affect first sexual experiences, especially for teens, queer youth, and those in close-in-age relationships. Back in episode 6, I shared that a Law and Order SUV episode is what sparked this podcast. In the same episode, there's a scene that stuck with me. Detective Velasco quietly tells Captain Benson about his first sexual experience. At 15, an older neighbor, recently divorced, came into his room during a party and performed sexual acts on him while his parents danced downstairs. When Benson asked if he's ever told anyone, he says, "Yes, you, just now." That moment really hit hard. Consent, age, and power can blur so quickly, especially for teens, and the law doesn't always feel clear or fair. So today, we're talking the good, the bad, and the illegal. How age of consent laws, close-in-age expectations, and real-life gray areas shape first sexual experiences. Whether you've lived through something like Velasco's story, or you're a parent trying to start this conversation with your teenager, this episode is for you. There are so many assumptions when it comes to the law and sex, and most of them are flat out wrong. Like, if we're both underage, we're fine. Or, if it's consensual, it can't be illegal. The truth? The law doesn't always follow logic, and it definitely doesn't always follow lived experiences. So to help us make sense of the legal landscape and what it means for young people navigating their first times, we're joined by Dr. Neil McArthur again in this episode. Dr. McArthur is the director of the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics at the University of Manitoba, and his research focuses on the ethics of sexuality and relationships. He's here to help us unpack what young people need to know and what the law often gets wrong. Welcome to the show once again, Dr. McArthur. It's so lovely to have you back.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's start with this big one, the idea that if it's consensual, it's legal. A lot of people assume that as long as both people agree, they're in the clear. But that's not always how the law works, especially when someone is under the legal age of consent. Can you help us unpack why that assumption can be misleading and what young people need to understand about how the law actually defines consent?
I think the law obviously does define consent in terms of people agreeing, but then there are various ways in which people's agreement can be seen as not legally valid. Age is certainly one of them. Intoxication is another. There may be certain forms of mental disability that are seen to affect people's ability to consent. So, yeah, the law basically creates a certain number of exceptions around the ability to consent. They mostly have to do with being of sound mind and being fully informed. You also can't, I mean, deceive someone about the nature of a sexual act. So those are all ways that consent can be invalidated, legally speaking. But yeah, age is certainly one of the biggest ones. And I think that, most people would know that having sexual contact with a small child is not permissible and not morally permissible either. But yeah, I think there then arises some gray area when you get into older teenagers, and because for one thing, there just isn't a single age of consent around the world or even across the United States. I think that consent is defined legally at the state level in the United States, and we just don't have any one magic age where we say, okay, now people are able to consent.
And then there's the notion that the age gap doesn't matter if we're in love, or that if we're both teens, then it's fine. A lot of people assume that if both partners are close in age or they're in a relationship, a loving relationship, then the law won't get involved. Can you talk to us about those assumptions and why they can be risky?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing people should know is that it's risky because, as I said, there's no single law of consent across the United States. It depends heavily on, well, it depends entirely on the state that you're in. And there isn't a lot of consistency between states. So there are states, I think most states now, something like 30 states, have age gap provisions. So what they say is that below a certain age, someone cannot consent. But if your partner is below that age and you are within 2 or 3 years of their age, so what we're talking about here is a 15-year-old with a 17-year-old partner, or a 14-year-old with a 16-year-old partner. If there are those small age gaps, then you are legally okay. But yeah, that isn't always the case, and there are cases of people being charged criminally for relationships with people very close to them in age. So it's risky because you just need to know what the laws are within your own jurisdiction.
Then there's also this idea that the law protects everyone equally, but it may not always be the case for LGBTQ plus teens, for example. Can you speak to how unequal legal systems can impact queer youth when it comes to first-time experiences, and what needs to change to make the law safer and more inclusive for everybody?
Well, yeah, I mean, historically, there have been different ages of consent for queer people for same-sex relationships. There are, when age gap laws were first introduced, they were not applied to same-sex relationships. So there's been a lot of just outright legal inequalities where same-sex relationships were not treated the same way. I mean, I guess you could start simply with the fact that up until the Lawrence v. Texas decision in the United States, there were states in which same-sex sex was simply illegal no matter what the age. So, it's taken a long time for us to achieve even a formal equality where same-sex relationships are treated the same way in every way legally in terms of how the law is written. In terms of how the law is enforced, there are still huge inequalities. I think partly because there's this myth that is still being promoted by many politicians that queer people, this is really a long-standing myth, that queer people somehow, target underage people, particularly that queer people are particularly prone to targeting underage people. And that also, I think part of the anxiety is it was always believed, or it was long believed, that young people are vulnerable to being quote unquote recruited, or, somehow if they have contact with someone older than them who's, wanting a same-sex relationship, they'll make them gay, basically. So now we know, first of all, that queer people are no more likely to target underage people, to victimize underage people than are straight people. And we know that young people are not going to be lured away from being straight if they are not, gay by orientation. So, some of that has receded, although, as I say, there are still politicians who sort of prey on those fears. But then in terms of how the laws are that are on the books, even if they're formally equal, how they're enforced, there are just a lot more prosecutions of young people. And I should say, by the way, I don't think I mentioned earlier, I mean, there are still some states that don't have age gap provisions and where anyone below a certain age, anyone who has sex with someone below a certain age can be prosecuted, even if that person themselves was below a certain age. So if you have two 15-year-olds who have sex, the law could theoretically could prosecute both of them. And so, there are lots of prosecutions of underage people for having sex with underage people. And those prosecutions, as well as prosecutions around age gaps, where there's, a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old, and there isn't an age gap provision in the law, for instance. All those kinds of prosecutions, gays and lesbians, queer people are much more likely to be targeted by those kinds of prosecutions. Prosecutors go after people much more often. One of the reasons is because a lot of these prosecutions happen because a parent will report someone's having sex with my daughter, someone's having sex with my son. And parents are a lot more likely to report those kinds of relationships if they are same-sex relationships, because a lot of parents still have homophobia and they don't want their kid involved in a same-sex relationship. So they'll sometimes call on the law to enforce that prejudice. So, there is both, I think there's a lot of homophobia that still exists among law enforcement, and then homophobia among parents. And both of these things contribute to being the case that, legally speaking, queer youth are much more vulnerable to prosecution.
I'm reminded of a case that happened a year ago or so. The people involved were not queer, but it's an example of how, jurisdictions differ, where an 18-year-old was jailed in the UAE for having sex with a 17-year-old, and they are both British. So they were there on holiday and they both agreed. And then, as you mentioned, that the parents can report, the mother reported that this boy had sex with her daughter. And then he was prosecuted in the UAE because the laws are different from the laws in the UK.
Yeah, and I think another element here, unfortunately, is race as well. I think that you also find these prosecutions where parents are disapproving of kids being in relationships with someone of a different race. And so racism definitely plays into this as well.
So, what would be your best advice for young people trying to understand both the legal and the ethical sides of consent, especially during their first time?
Well, unfortunately, yeah, I think there are many jurisdictions where they kind of have to know what the law is. I think it never hurts to do a little research on what the law is if you feel like you might be on the wrong side of it. The main lesson is always to communicate with your partner and make sure that you both want to want to be there and want to be doing the things you're doing. I think that will always help with the ethical side of it. In terms of the legal side of it, then yeah, I think if you are younger, then I think it does pay to do a little research to the laws of the jurisdiction that you're in order to avoid problems. Because yeah, I mean it's too bad I mean it's tragic to see young people become the targets of the law. I think in a perfect world, we would have one set of laws everywhere, and I think those laws would reflect the need to protect young people while still allowing them maximum freedom. I mean, I think, ideally, what we're doing here is balancing the need to protect young people from exploitation with the desire to respect their autonomy and respect their life choices. And so I think, the law is always ideally trying to hit a balance of those. It doesn't always get it right. And so I think that, people do need to know at least a little bit potentially. If they think that there is, an age gap, I think it is worth knowing what the specific laws on consent are. And I think this should be at least part of what is taught in school. I think that it should be part of the education system. I think it is something that students need to know. And I think that, especially people who are members of racial minorities or who are queer, I think they need to understand that they can potentially be the target of the law. It's too bad. I wish that, I think we all wish that the system were more equal. But I think that people need to understand that there may be things about them that make them more vulnerable to prosecution. And so, that's something they need to be aware of in this area, just as in other areas of life.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. McArthur. Thank you for joining us and for breaking down the complex and often confusing legal sides of first-time sexual experiences. Your insights on consent, the age of consent laws, and how the law impacts young people have been incredibly valuable. We're so grateful to have your voice on this episode. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
The law is supposed to protect people, but sometimes it punishes the wrong ones or makes things harder to talk about. That's why knowledge is power. Whether your first time happened in a blur of uncertainty or felt overshadowed by fear of getting into trouble, you're not alone. There's so much more to learn and unlearn when it comes to sex, safety, and justice. Have a story about a first time shaped by legal confusion, fear, or rules that didn't make sense? Share it anonymously at bit.ly/Let's Talk First, or you can DM us at Let's Talk First. Next time on Sexual Encounters, the very first time, we're unpacking the difference between emotional intimacy and physical intimacy in our episode, First Love versus First Sex. What happens when your first time isn't with your first love? Or when it is, but it doesn't go the way you imagined? Don't miss it. You're listening to Sexual Encounters, the very first time.